Welcome to the Sci-Fi story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
He slapped a alien girl's tail and is unknowingly cursed to wit her welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Grand Orbital Station at Terna Nexus was a marvel of engineering, a neutral ground suspended between the wearing ambitions of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. Towering spires of polished alloy reached into the void. Massive glass panels revealed the endless cosmic expanse beyond, and within its gleaming halls representatives of various species gathered for what was meant to be a historic summit between the Zuri Dominion and the United Terran Coalition. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken undercurrents of distrust running deep beneath the polite diplomatic exchanges, but no one dared to openly acknowledge the fragile nature of this peace. Humanity had fought hard for its place among the stars, clawing its way from relative obscurity into relevance, and though the Zuri viewed them as little more than opportunistic upstarts, the necessity of cooperation had brought them to the negotiating table. Stanley Mercer, a man more accustomed to battlefield negotiations and backroom deals than the stifling formality of high diplomacy, found himself increasingly out of place in this ostentatious setting. He had been chosen not for his grace or tact, qualities he lacked in abundance, but for his ability to navigate the UN, predictable, to find opportunity in chaos. It was a quality that had served him well in the past, though at this moment he was beginning to wonder if he was truly cut out for this kind of diplomacy. The banquet hall was an extravagant display of wealth and power, a place where whispered agreements held more weight than entire fleets, and where a single misstep could mean the difference between lasting peace and all-out war. It was the kind of place where men like him rarely belonged. He had already made a few minor miscalculations that evening, nothing too catastrophic, but enough to earn a few disapproving glances from the human delegation he had spoken to informally. To an alien ambassador, mispronounced the title of a high-ranking Zeri official, and had inadvertently insulted a reptilian dignitary by refusing an offered drink that to humans smelled strongly of ammonia and was likely lethal. The evening was becoming a slow-moving diplomatic disaster, and as much as he wanted to escape the gilded confinement of the hall and breathe air that didn't cack of artificial civility, he knew he had to endure. The future of human-Zeri relations depended on these talks, and despite his lack of enthusiasm for the process, he was not about to be the reason it all fell apart. It was during one of these moments, when he had finally allowed himself to relax just a fraction, that fate decided to intervene in the most absurd way possible. He had been reaching for a drink, something vaguely resembling whiskey, but likely synthesized from alien ingredients, when a sudden movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A sleek, prehensile tail covered in smooth iridescent scales that shifted between shades of deep blue and silver flicked dangerously close to his face. Without thinking, without considering the implications of his actions, he reacted on pure instinct. With an almost casual motion, he swatted the tail aside, the impact producing an audible slap that echoed louder than it had any right to. In the hushed chamber, a deep, suffocating silence fell over the room. Conversations died mid-sentence, music ceased, and all eyes turned toward him with an intensity that sent an involuntary chill down his spine. It was only then, as he followed the tail's path back to its owner, that he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Banora, one of the Zuri Dominion's most esteemed envoys, stood rigid before him, her expression a perfect mask of barely restrained fury. She was tall, statuesque, with sharp, regal features that seemed almost sculpted to perfection. Her silver-black hair was intricately braided in the traditional fashion of her people, her dark, piercing eyes practically smoldering with the weight of an anger that transcended mere offense. Stanley's mind raced, trying to piece together what exactly he had done, why the entire hall now regarded him as if he had just committed an act of UN unspeakable atrocity. He had spent months studying Zeri customs, had been briefed extensively on their traditions, But nowhere had it been mentioned that touching Azeri's tail was anything more than an incidental fox paw, and yet the reactions around him suggested that he had done something far worse. Benora exhaled sharply, her gaze locked onto him. As she stepped forward, the weight of her presence alone enough to make lesser men cower. "You dare," she said, her voice dangerously calm, carrying the measured tone of someone who was barely holding themselves back from lashing out. "You dare to lay your hand upon me in such a manner?" Stanley raised his hands in a placating gesture, already acutely aware that no explanation was likely to save him. "Listen, I didn't, you did," she interrupted, her words laced with venom. "And by doing so you have invoked the vow of binding." The words meant nothing to him, but the reaction from the gathered Zeri dignitaries made it abundantly clear that whatever this vow of binding was, it was not something easily dismissed. Murmurs rippled through the room, and several high-ranking Zeri officials exchanged knowing glances, their expressions ranging from amusement to outright horror. The Zeri matriarch herself, an imposing figure seated at the head of the chamber, regarded Stanley with something resembling cold satisfaction. "Wait, hold on, Stanley," said his voice firmed despite the rapidly growing sense of dread curling in his gut. "I don't know what that means, but let's all take a deep breath before we start declaring war over a tail slap. The vow of binding is not a minor slight," Benora said, her voice growing issier. "It is an ancient law, one that is absolute. When one of our kind is struck in such a manner, it is seen as an unbreakable challenge, a declaration of intent by our laws. You have, whether by ignorance or intent, bound yourself to me. You are now cursed to wed me." Stanley blinked. His brain rejected the words at first, as if they had been spoken in some alien dialect beyond comprehension. Then, as the reality of her statements settled in, a laugh almost bubbled up from deep within him, not because it was funny, not because it was a joke, but because the sheer absurdity of it was too overwhelming for any rational reaction. "You're kidding," he said, though from the looks on their faces, no one seemed to be joking. "You have got to be kidding. You think this is a joke?" Benora hissed, stepping closer, her tail flicking in agitation. "You have insulted my honor in a way that cannot be undone. The only options before us are compliance or conflict. Either you accept this fate, or the Dominion will see this as an act of aggression against our people." Stanley turned, searching the faces of his fellow human delegates for some kind of support, but they were as stunned as he was. Even the seasoned diplomats, men and women trained to navigate the impossible, looked utterly lost for words. The matriarch, watching with an almost eerie level of amusement, finally spoke, her voice like the slow toll of a funeral bell. "It is done. The vow has been invoked, and it cannot be undone. You will wed, or you will face the consequences." And just like that, in the span of mere moments, Stanley Mercer went from being an unfortunate human envoy to a man cursed to wed a furious alien warrior, and all because of one damn tail slap. Stanley Mercer could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes in the banquet hall pressing down on him like a lean vice, a silent judgment rendered by an audience. He barely understood. His brain struggled to catch up with what had just happened, to piece together the absurdity of the moment, to find some rational loophole that would undo whatever ridiculous cultural rule he had inadvertently tripped over. A diplomatic nightmare had unfolded in real time, and now he was standing at the epicenter of a slow-motion catastrophe, all because he had slapped the tail of an alien woman. It wasn't as if he had done it on purpose. It wasn't as if he had walked up to her and declared some grand gesture of dominance or insulted. Was an accident, pure reflex, a careless motion that should have been nothing more than an awkward moment quickly forgotten. And yet here he was staring at a furious Ballora, who looked as though she were weighing the merits of gutting him. Where he stood, Beller's dark, piercing eyes bore into him with an intensity that sent a prickle of unease crawling down his spine. She was tall, statuesque, with an almost unnatural elegance that made her look as if she had been sculpted from living obsidian. The smooth, iridescent scales that covered her tail shimmered under the artificial lights of the grand chamber, a stark contrast to the deep purple and black ceremonial garments that draped her form. She exuded an aura of barely restrained fury, and Stanley had the distinct impression that she would have already run him through with one of those curved ceremonial daggers she carried at her waist. Had it not been for the weight of tradition bearing down upon her, the matriarch of the Zeri Dominion, seated at the head of the chamber on an elevated platform, observed the unfolding debacle with a detached amusement that made Stanley's stomach churn. She was an imposing figure, her presence so commanding that even without speaking she radiated an aura of absolute authority. The golden crown-like adornments that framed her face glinted under the ambient lighting, and her slitted amber eyes gleamed with something bordering on satisfaction. The woman was enjoying this. "The vow of binding is absolute," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with an eerie calmness, as though she were discussing a simple contract negotiation, rather than the fate of two unwilling individuals. "It has been invoked. It must be honored." Stanley ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply as he tried to compose himself. The diplomats on the Terran side of the hall remained deathly silent, clearly just as blindsided by this as he was, their expressions ranging from barely contained horror to quiet resignation. They knew there was no simple way out of this. Stanley might not have been an expert in Zeri culture, but he understood political leverage, and right now the Zeri Dominion had all of it if he refused, if he made even the slightest misstep in rejecting this so-called vow. It could be seen as an unforgivable insult, one that might very well escalate tensions between their species to a breaking point. He had seen wars begin over pettier grievances. Still, there had to be a way out of this. He wasn't just going to stand here and accept the idea that his fate had been sealed by an accident. He turned to one of the senior human diplomats, a graying man with the weary look of someone who had spent far too many years navigating political minefields. "Tell me we have a diplomatic clause for this," Stanley muttered under his breath, his voice laced with equal parts desperation and frustration. The diplomat, Ambassador Hawkins, adjusted his pristine uniform and spoke in the careful, measured tone of a man who already knew the answer but was trying to soften the blow. "The Zeri Dominion's cultural laws are rigid. The vow of binding is not something that can simply be dismissed without consequences." Stanley's stomach twisted. "Consequences?" he echoed. "You mean war?" The ambassador's silence was answer enough. Beller, still fuming but composed enough to speak, stepped closer, her tone clipped and controlled. "I will not be dishonored because of your ignorance, human." The way she said human carried a weight of barely concealed disdain, as if the very word was an insult on her tongue. "You have invoked the vow. Whether you intended to or not, to refuse it now would be an act of supreme disrespect, one that would demand retribution." Stanley exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So what, we just get married just like that?" "I didn't exactly propose. You know, the vow of binding is not merely ceremonial," Belora countered, her tone growing colder by the second. "It is a contract of unity enforced by our traditions. To violate it is to violate the honor of my people." Stanley let out a bitter laugh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Well, forgive me if I don't exactly feel honored by the idea of being shackled to someone who looks like they'd rather flay me alive." Her tail flicked sharply, her nostrils flaring in an almost imperceptible show of restrained anger. "You think I want this, that I desire to be bound to some undisciplined, reckless human who does not even have the decency to understand the consequences of his actions? I am Belano of the House of Vale, third daughter of the High Lineage Commander of the Silver Fleet. You are nothing more than an unfortunate complication." Stanley sighed, shaking his head. "Great. So we're in agreement. Neither of us wants this. Now how do we get out of it?" A low murmur passed through the gathered Zeri officials, and it was the matriarch who finally answered. "There is only one way to nullify the vow," she said. And for the first time her expression darkened with something resembling true amusement. "A trial of worthiness." Stanley frowned. "That sounds suspiciously like a death sentence." Bellenor's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "For someone like you, it very well might be." The hall erupted in quiet murmurs once more as the weight of those words settled over them. A trial of worthiness, whatever it entailed, was clearly something brutal. Stanley had faced plenty of trials in his lifetime, but he had the distinct feeling that whatever the Zeri considered worthiness was something far beyond his usual line of work. Still, as the reality of his situation cemented itself, he realized there was no easy path forward. He could either risk dishonor and potential war by refusing outright, or he could try to fight his way out of this ridiculous mess through whatever trial they saw fit to throw at him. Neither option was appealing, but at least the latter gave him a fighting chance. Stanley exhaled, slowly rolling his shoulders. As he turned his gaze back to Belano Fine, he said, the weight of the words settling over him like an iron. "Chain Letton do this trial, but don't expect me to go down easy, Bellin." Or's expression didn't soften, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, whether it was approval or just the anticipation of watching him suffer. He couldn't say. "The trials will begin at dawn," the matriarch declared, her voice carrying finality. "May the stars decide your fate." And with that, Stanley Mercer, a man who had only come to this summit to represent humanity's interests, now found himself fighting for his very survival. Stanley Mercer had spent his life surviving against impossible odds, from the back alleys of Earth's megacities to the ruthless void of space. He had clawed his way through war zones, corporate betrayals, and diplomatic failures, but nothing had prepared him for this. He stood in the dimly lit chamber beneath ET Terna Nexus, stripped of his usual comforts, staring at the circular arena carved into the smooth obsidian-like stone of the Zeri trial grounds. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, a mix of burnt minerals and something faintly metallic, the walls marked with runes that pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence. This was no ordinary testing ground. This was a place where warriors were forged, where the weak were called, and where Zeri tradition dictated that only the worthy could stand beside their people in honor. And for the first time in his life, Stanley wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the fate of an entire species. Whether he liked it or not, Belora stood across from him, her expression unreadable, her posture as rigid as ever. She was clad in the ceremonial battle garb of her people, a form-fitting suit of woven metallic fibers that shimmered under the dim lighting, the insignia of her noble house embed along the seams. She was everything he was not: elegant, composed, trained from birth to uphold the traditions of her people. To her, this was just another challenge, another test to be passed to him. It was a nightmare. He had no business being a part of. The matriarch loomed above them. From her elevated throne, her piercing golden eyes locking onto Stanley with something between curiosity and amusement. "The trial of worthiness," she announced, her voice reverberating through the chamber with weight that could not be ignored, "is not simply a test of physical prowess. To be bound to one of our kind, a warrior of the Zeri Dominion, you must prove that you are not merely an accident of fate. You must demonstrate strength, cunning, and the will to endure. You must prove that your presence in our culture is not a stain upon our honor." Stanley swallowed hard but kept his face impassive. He had expected something like this. The Zeri were a proud people bound to their traditions, their hierarchies, their rigid structures of honor and duty. If he had any chance of walking away from this with his head still attached to his body, he needed to play their game, at least for now. Benora spoke, then her voice sharp as a blade. "There are 3 trials. The first, the trial of strength, will determine whether you possess the resilience to stand beside a Zari. The second, the trial of wit, will test your mind and ability to navigate the complexities of our people. And the third, the trial of spirit, will prove whether you are worthy of standing at my side." Stanley arched a brow at that last one. It didn't escape him that she had chosen her words carefully. Worthy of standing at her side, not as her husband, not as her equal, but as someone who might one day earn a fraction of her respect. That was fine. He didn't need her respect. He just needed to survive. The matriarch raised her hand, and the first trial began without warning. Morning, the ground beneath Stanley shifted. Panels of the floor retracted with an ominous hiss, and from the depths of the chamber, a hulking figure emerged, a Zari warrior larger than any he had ever seen, clad in heavy armor that gleamed under the bioluminescent light. His features were obscured by an ornate battle helmet, but the sheer weight of his presence was enough to make Stanley's gut tight. "This is Vector, one of our finest warriors," the matriarch declared. "You will face him in combat. You need not when you only need to endure." Stanley barely had time to react before Vector lunged. The first blow was a blur of motion, faster than something that size had any right to be. Stanley barely managed to throw himself to the side, the air screaming as a massive fist passed inches from his face. He rolled to his feet, already assessing his options. He wasn't a trained soldier, not in the way the Zuri were, but he knew how to fight dirty. He had spent enough time in the back alleys of Earth's mega-cities to know that strength alone didn't win fights. Strategy did. Vector charged again. And this time, Stanley didn't dodge outright. Instead, he let the warrior overcome it, Sid stepping at the last moment and delivering a sharp elbow to the side of the alien's knee. The impact was like striking a reinforced bulkhead. But it was enough to throw Vector off balance. For half a second was all Stanley needed. He darted backward, forcing Vector to adjust his footing. The Zuri was stronger, faster, and more skilled, but Stanley had spent his life surviving against people who should have killed him a dozen times over. He didn't fight fair. He fought smart. For several agonizing minutes he continued this game, dodging, countering, making the warrior expend energy. He knew he couldn't win. That wasn't the goal. He just had to endure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vector halted his attack. The great warrior let out a rumbling laugh, nodding in approval. Before stepping back, the human endures. The matriarch announced the first trial is past. Stanley barely had time to catch his breath before the second trial began. This time, he found himself facing a different kind of challenge, a series of intricate puzzles, each one tied to some obscure Zuri tradition, a labyrinth of political maneuvering and logical traps designed to test his ability to think like one of them. He wasn't a scholar, but he was quick on his feet, and he had spent enough time navigating human bureaucracy to recognize patterns. When he saw them, he adapted, he adjusted, and when he didn't know the answer, he bluffed his way through with confidence. By the time he reached the final trial, he was exhausted, his body aching from the first, his mind frayed from the second. The trial of spirit was the one that truly tested him. He stood alone in the chamber, separated from Benora and the others. A voice echoed in his mind, the chamber itself seemingly alive with ancient energy. The trial was not physical, it was not intellectual, it was something deeper. It forced him to confront himself. Images of his past flickered before him, the failures, the regrets, the choices that had led him here. He saw the faces of those he had let down, the paths he had abandoned, the moments where he could have been a better man. It stripped him bare, left him vulnerable, forced him to acknowledge his own shortcomings, and in the end, he stood. When the trial ended, he found himself back in the chamber, Belano watching him with something unreadable in her expression. The human passes, the matriarch declared, and for the first time, Stanley saw something shift in Belen, or his gaze. Not respect. Not yet, but something close. It was done. He had survived. But the real battle had only just begun. The trials had ended, but the weight of them still to Stanley like a suffocating fog, the exhaustion settling into his bones, as if he had aged a decade in the span of a single day. His body ached from the brutal test of endurance against Vector. His mind still reeled from the labyrinth of logic and deception that had nearly broken him, and his soul, if he still had one, felt hollow after the trial of spirit had forced him to confront the ghosts of his past. And yet, despite it all, he had survived. He had done the impossible, or at least what everyone else had assumed would be impossible. He had faced the sacred rites of the Zuri and emerged on the other side, not as a victor, but as something far more dangerous, a man who refused to break. But there was no celebration, no moment of relief where he could catch his breath and revel in his unexpected survival. The air in the chamber still hung heavy with unspoken tension, as if no one quite knew what to make of him. Benora had watched him the entire time, her dark, piercing eyes unreadable, her expression caught somewhere between reluctant approval and quiet disbelief. She had wanted him to fail. He could see it in the tightness of her posture, in the way her tail coiled slightly at her side, as if struggling to contain frustration. She had expected him to falter, to collapse beneath the weight of tradition, to be exposed as nothing more than a fool who had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. But he hadn't, and now, bound by the very custom she had invoked, she was left with a choice. She likely loathed to acknowledge his worthiness or risked defying the very laws she had used as a weapon against him. The matriarch's voice shattered the silence, smooth and deliberate, carrying the weight of finality. It is decided. The human has proven himself. The vow of binding stands. She studied Stanley for a long moment, those eerie golden eyes drinking him in, as if trying to decipher the puzzle of his existence. "And so, Stanley Mercer, you will take your place at Orr's side." Stanley barely managed to suppress a groan. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud still hit him. Like a gut punch, he glanced toward Benora, expecting some final look of scorn, but her expression was inscrutable. Her gaze locked onto him with a measured intensity. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction in knowing that the human had endured. If anything, she looked as though she had just been handed a burden. She had no desire to carry. The assembled Zeri nobles murmured amongst themselves, some in hushed approval, others in barely concealed disdain. The warriors among them, the ones who understood the value of endurance, seemed to regard him with something bordering on respect. The diplomats, however, those who had spent their lives building the rigid social structure of their people, eyed him as one might observe a particularly irritating anomaly, something that should not exist, and yet somehow did, as if sensing his exhaustion. Bell and Nor stepped forward, her voice cool and unwavering. "He has passed the trials," she said, addressing the matriarch rather than Stanley. "The law is clear, but the path forward is not. We will need time to acclimate." The word hung between them, a polite way of saying that neither of them had any idea how the hell they were supposed to move forward from this. The matriarch inclined her head slightly, an amused flicker crossing her features. "Very well. You will both be given time to prepare for what comes next, but the bond is sealed. There is no turning back." And with that, the decision was made the moment the formal proceedings ended. Stanley barely had a chance to breathe before Belorette turned on her heel and strode out of the chamber without so much as a backward glance. He hesitated for only a moment before following, trailing after her as she moved with precise, almost mechanical grace through the grand corridors of a turn and nexus. The station was as much a political battleground as it was a technological marvel, its halls designed not only for function but for spectacle, each towering structure serving as a testament to the power and influence of the civilizations that gathered here. Benora remained silent as they walked, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Stanley had seen many types of warriors in his life, those who reveled in battle, those who fought out of necessity, those who carried the scars with quiet pride. But Belora was something different. She wasn't just a soldier, she was something far more ingrained in the fabric of her people's identity. She carried the weight of an entire culture on her back, and now, thanks to him, she was being forced to carry something else. It wasn't until they reached a quieter section of the station, away from the murmuring crowds and the ever-present eyes of the Dominion's elite, that she finally stopped. Turning sharply, she faced him, her tail flicking in barely restrained irritation. "This changes nothing," she said, her voice like ice. "Do not mistake survival for acceptance." Stanley exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Trust me, princess, I'm not delusional enough to think you suddenly like me." Her jaw tightened slightly at the nickname, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, the tension in her stance practically radiating off her. "Do you think this is some joke, some minor inconvenience, that you can charm your way out of? This is my life, my honor, my future, and because of you it is no longer mine to control." Stanley let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah, well, welcome to the club. You think I wanted this? I was just here for some pointless diplomacy, maybe shake a few hands, pretend I gave a damn about interstellar politics. Now I'm engaged to an alien war, princess, and apparently one step away from causing a diplomatic crisis." Her eyes narrowed, the flicker of something dangerous flashing across her face. "Then perhaps you should have been more careful with your hands," he sighed, shaking his head. "Right, because I should have known that a tail slap equals a lifelong commitment in your culture, a real intuitive system you've got there." For a brief moment there was silence, a tense standoff between two people who had been forced into something neither of them wanted. Then finally Bora's expression shifted ever so slightly, not softening. No, he doubted that was even possible, but adjusting, as if coming to terms with a reality she couldn't change regardless. She said, more measured this time, "You are bound to me now, and whether you like it or not, that means you will have to prove yourself again. The trials were only the beginning. The real test is survival." Stanley rolled his shoulders. the exhaustion still lingering in his limbs. Great, more proving myself just what I wanted. She gave him a long appraising look before turning away. We depart for Vexel tomorrow. You will see for yourself what it means to be bound to the Zori. And just like that, the conversation was over as Stanley watched her disappear down the corridor. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had survived the trials, but something told him the hardest part of this ordeal was only just beginning. The journey to Vext was an exercise in prolonged ion, a suffocating silence stretching between Stanley and Benora as they traveled aboard her personal warship, the Zaraki. Unlike the pristine diplomatic halls of Etern Nexus, this vessel was a beast of war, sleek, predatory, forged in the fires of a military empire that had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest. Its dark metal hull was adorned with intricate engravings of Zeri history, depictions of battle of warriors standing victorious over fallen enemies, of great cosmic beasts slain by their ancestors. It was not merely a ship, it was a testament to the might of Belen Or's people, and Stanley felt its silent judgment with every step he took. The crew, all Zeri, regarded him with expressions that ranged from thinly veiled disgust to cold indifference to them. He was an unwelcome anomaly, a walking stain on the honor of their commander, a human who had no right to stand where he stood. He could hear the whispered words when they thought he wasn't listening, words in their native tongue that even without translation carried the unmistakable weight of contempt. It was clear that none of them expected him to last long, and they weren't subtle about their opinions. He was an outsider, an intruder in their world, and no matter what the trials had proven, they did not see him as worthy. Beller had not spoken to him since they left the station. She had remained distant, coldly professional, retreating into the command decks of the ship, her presence felt but never truly seen. She was avoiding him, and in truth he was grateful for it. There was nothing left to say between them. Their fates had been sealed, bound by the unbreakable grip of Zeri law, and whatever resentment simmered beneath the surface would have to wait for now. The only thing that mattered was surviving whatever awaited him on her home world. When they finally entered orbit around Vexel, Stanley was struck by the sheer, untamed beauty of the planet. It was nothing like the urban sprawls of Earth or the sterile mega structures of the Coalition's core worlds. This was a world still claimed by nature, its land masses covered in vast, dense jungles of towering obsidian trees, with luminous blue foliage, rivers that shimmered with bioluminescent algae, mountain ranges that cut through the sky like jagged spires of onyx. The planet pulsed with life, a primordial energy that was both breathtaking and deeply, unnervingly alien. As the ship descended toward one of the Zeri strongholds, Stanley could already see the massive stone citadel rising from the jungle, a fortress built into the very mountainside, its architecture ancient yet reinforced with modern technology. Enormous banners depicting the sigil of Belen Or's house fluttered against the wind, deep crimson against the dark stone, a reminder of the legacy she carried even from a distance. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. This was not just a home, this was a domain. The landing was smooth, but the welcome was anything but. The moment he stepped onto the platform, flanked by Belen Or's guards, he felt the weight of countless stares pressing down on him. Warriors in ornate battle armor lined the approach, their golden visors locked onto him with unreadable expressions. Above them, perched on stone outcroppings, creatures that resembled winged panthers with razor-sharp tails watched silently, their piercing red eyes tracking his every move. Even the air here felt heavier, as if the planet itself was pressing down on him, testing him, waiting for him to prove that he belonged. Benora finally broke her silence as they approached the grand entrance of the citadel. "You will be tested here," she said, her voice clipped, controlled, betraying no emotion. "The trials on Etern and Nexus may have proven your endurance, but survival here requires more than strength. It requires instinct." Stanley gave a humorless chuckle. "You mean it requires me not to get eaten?" She didn't smile. "If you lack the instincts to avoid death, then you do not belong here." She led him through the massive gates, and the interior of the citadel was just as imposing as the exterior. The halls were carved from the mountain itself, vast corridors lined with burning braziers, tapestries depicting the conquests of the Vale bloodline, relics of past wars Played like trophies, there was no mistaking it. This was a warrior's home, a place where the strong thrived, and the weak were forgotten. Benora guided him toward what appeared to be a training arena, a wide circular space, surrounded by stone pillars, the ground covered in soft dark earth. Waiting there was an older Zuri male, his scales of deep weathered silver, his body scarred from a lifetime of battle, his eyes golden like Belano but lacking the sharp cruelty of youth, studied Stanley with a calculating gaze. "This is General Cal Valores," said. "He is my mentor. He will oversee your training." Katal stepped forward, his towering presence just as imposing as any warrior Stanley had faced. So he said, his voice deep and resonant, "This is the human who has disrupted the order of things." Stanley met his gaze without flinching. "Depends on your perspective. From where I'm standing, your order of things could use a little disruption." For a long moment there was silence. Then, to his surprise, Katal let out a rumbling chuckle. "You have spirit, that is good, but spirit alone does not keep one alive on Vexel." He gestured toward the arena. "Belorit says you are to be tested. Very well. We will see if your kind is as resilient as they claim." Stanley exhaled slowly. He had no doubt that whatever was coming next would push him to his limits, but he had survived the trials before. He had endured. He wasn't about to break now. Benora stepped past him, pausing only for a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you fail, I will not intervene." Stanley smirked, rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward. "Wouldn't expect you to." And with that, the real test began. Stanley stood at the center of the arena, the humid air thick against his skin, carrying the scent of burning braziers and the metallic tang of the damp earth beneath his boots. He could feel the weight of the gathered Zuri pressing down on him, their silent gazes like unseen hands wrapping around his throat, judging, assessing, waiting for him to prove himself or fail spectacularly. The heat of the twin suns above Vexel bore down upon him, adding to the discomfort, but he refused to show weakness. He had learned long ago that in places where strength was the only currency that mattered, showing even the slightest crack would only invite ruin. Belano had made it clear from the start. This was no mere training exercise, no symbolic gesture of initiation. This was a test of survival, and if he failed, there would be no second chances. General Katal stood a few paces away, his expression unreadable, the scars along his scaled face a testament to a lifetime spent on the battlefield. The older Zuri warrior was the first Stanley had met who did not immediately radiate open hostility toward him, but that did not mean he was any less dangerous. If anything, the calculating look in Cal's golden eyes suggested that he was measuring Stanley's worth not by his presence here, but by how much suffering he could endure before he broke. Benora stood at the edge of the arena, arms crossed, her tail coiled at her side, her expression locked into something between cool detachment and quiet scrutiny. She had no intention of helping him. If he failed here, he would not only be an embarrassment to himself, but to her as well. Cal gestured toward the far end of the arena, where a series of weapons were embedded in the hardened soil: bladed staffs, curved swords with obsidian edges, strange whip-like chains adorned with serrated spikes. "Choose," the general commanded, his deep voice carrying across the arena like the toll of a war drum. "You will not leave this place untested." Stanley exhaled, rolling his shoulders, feeling the soreness still lingering in his muscles from the past few days. He walked forward, surveying the weapons with a careful eye. He was no stranger to combat, but Zuri weaponry was a different beast, altogether designed for creatures stronger, faster, and deadlier than humans. If he picked something too unwieldy, he would only be dooming himself further. He finally settled on a compact, double-edged blade with a grip that felt natural in his hands, its weight balanced despite its alien craftsmanship. He wasn't a master swordsman, but he knew how to use a blade when necessary. It wasn't about elegance, it was about efficiency. He turned back to Katal, gripping the weapon firmly. "All right," he said, smirking despite himself. "Who am I fighting?" Katal smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Survival is not about who stands against you," he said. "It is about enduring what the world throws at you." Stanley barely had time to process the meaning behind those words before the ground beneath him trembled. A low guttural growl echoed from the far side of the arena, and the moment he turned toward the source, he felt the unmistakable sting of adrenaline flood his veins. A massive creature at least 10 foot tall at the shoulder slithered out from a heavy iron gate that had been raised at the far end of the arena. Its body was thick, with layered armored scales that shimmered dark blue under the light of the suns. Its elongated skull, lined with jagged fangs, black eyes reflecting nothing but hunger. It was a predator, a thing designed to kill, and it had just locked onto him as its next meal. Stanley's grip on the blade tightened. "Oh, come on," he muttered under his breath. "I thought this was training." "Not a damn gladiator." Pitcow's voice was unwavering. "On Vexel, you learn by doing. If you are to be bound to our people, you must understand what it means to live as we do. This is your lesson." The creature lunged. Stanley barely had time to move before it was on him, its massive form a blur of muscle and scale. He threw himself to the side, feeling the wind of its attack graze past his back. The sheer